Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into something that's probably crossed your mind if you've ever thought about
Yep.
teaching, or maybe even just your own time back in school. Educational psychology.
Mm.
All those theories, principles, do they actually make a real-world difference when you're trying to help someone learn? We've all sort of wondered how much of that textbook stuff truly translates to being a better teacher.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, you've brought an incredibly insightful review that gets right to the heart of that question. It looks at, well, what educational psychology is all about, how it's taught to future educators, and maybe most importantly, whether it actually has an impact in the classroom. Our mission today is basically to unpack all of this using this study that really dug into educational psychology textbooks and even surveyed the instructors teaching these courses.
Okay, so let's kick things off with the big one. What exactly is educational psychology? It might seem obvious, but the review gives us a few different angles from some of the key thinkers in the field.
It does. It's fascinating, actually, to see how the definition has sort of evolved, but there's this core idea that sticks around. Back in '92, Whitrock defined it as this effort to really understand and improve how people develop their abilities through formal learning.
Right.
And that covers a huge range, from the specifics of teaching a subject to the inner workings of a student's mind, their feelings, their background, even how we measure what they've learned. It's a very, very broad view.
It really is. And then Berliner, also in '92, brought in the classroom context more, defining it as studying what teachers and students actually do and think while learning a curriculum in a specific environment. It's kind of getting down to the nitty-gritty, the practical
It's
reality.
exactly the action, yeah. And if we go back a bit further to '68 with Ausubel, the focus was more on the nature of school learning itself and how well students actually hold on to what they learn. He particularly emphasized meaningful verbal learning and how all those individual student things, their thinking, development, emotions, motivations come into play.
So we see this like spectrum from the really broad principles down to the individual student's experience. The review also mentions a committee from '87 defining it as developing, testing, and applying theories about learning and teaching for lifelong learning. That's interesting looking beyond just K-12.
Yeah, it is. But what's really striking is the underlying consistency. As the review points out, even though our understanding of psychology itself has shifted over time, from focusing on the basic bits of the mind to how mental processes help us function and then to how connections form, learning educational psychology has always been fundamentally about understanding and improving learning in schools and other educational settings.
Hmm.
The core questions have stayed pretty much the same. How and why do we learn? How do we grow and change as learners? What makes each of us learn differently? How do we even know what someone has learned? And ultimately, what's the whole point of education anyway?
It's like the field has this central mission, but the tools and perspectives it uses evolve with our broader understanding of the human mind.
Precisely. And the sheer scope of the field is remarkable. The Journal of Educational Psychology, which started way back in 1910, apparently covered an incredibly wide range of topics, acting as this crucial link between the general field of psychology and the very specific challenges and opportunities of teaching.
Absolutely. Like educational psychology is this bridge connecting, I don't know, the lab to the classroom. Right.
Yeah, exactly. The review even quotes Ball saying, "In the house of educational psychology, there are many rooms," which really just drives home how diverse the field is.
Which I guess naturally leads us to how all this breadth gets translated to students, the ones actually preparing to become teachers. The reviews suggest that textbooks tend to reflect this wide scope for a couple of key reasons.
Right. One being that graduate programs in EdPsych, well, they need to cover a lot of ground to prepare future researchers and academics, people who'll teach this stuff later.
They need that broad foundation. Makes sense.
Exactly. And the other reason is that textbook authors are very aware of the different professional organizations, the bodies that set standards, various special interest groups within education. They're aiming to be comprehensive, trying to address a wide range of perspectives and needs.
Okay, yeah. They're trying to create a resource that satisfies a lot of different stakeholders.
Yeah.
So how does this broad idea actually show up in the textbooks themselves? The review mentions some analysis of textbook content.
Yeah, it refers to Feldhusen's work from back in the '70s. He looked at a bunch of popular textbooks then and identified 20 core topics. And interestingly, when he surveyed educational psychologists at the time, the vast majority of these topics were considered either absolutely necessary or moderately necessary.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, things like how we learn, what motivates us, how we assess learning, student development, individual learning differences, and even classroom management. It paints a picture of a field that even back then considered a lot of ground pretty essential.
Okay, so there was a pretty strong agreement on what the field should cover back then. And then the review moves on to a more recent look at textbooks, conducted after 1990. How did things change?
Well, what's really revealing here is seeing what shifted and what sort of stayed the same. This more recent analysis identified 26 topics in these newer textbooks. One notable change was the disappearance of mental hygiene as a specific topic, kind of an old-fashioned term, maybe?
Yeah, definitely sounds dated.
And cultural differences emerged as a distinct area of focus, which definitely reflects broader societal changes and a growing understanding within the field itself.
Absolutely, that makes total sense. And out of those 26 topics, it sounds like a few really took up the most page space in the textbooks.
They did. Instructional methods and practices, the actual how-to of teaching along with motivation, how we process information, information processing theory, classroom assessment and evaluation, classroom management, and understanding intellectual differences. Those accounted for over half the pages in a typical textbook.
Wow, over half. Those seem like pretty fundamental areas for anyone stepping into a teaching role.
Definitely the kind of things you'd expect a new teacher to be thinking about, yeah.
Okay.
And then there was kind of a second tier of topics that still received significant attention.
Okay.
Yes, topics like operant conditioning, that's the learning through rewards and consequences, Skinner and all that cognitive development, standardized testing, and cultural and socioeconomic differences also received considerable coverage. So there's definitely kind of hierarchy in terms of what's emphasized in these books.
But what really jumped out at me was the inconsistency. How wildly different the coverage could be for certain areas across different textbooks.
Exactly. For topics like social processes, understanding how students interact with each other, and research methods, the variation in page count across different textbooks was actually greater than the average page count itself.
Wait, say that again? The variation was bigger than the average.
Yeah. I mean, some books went really deep, while others barely, scratched the surface.
That's a huge difference. Imagine if your understanding of how peer relationships impact learning depended entirely on which textbook your professor happened to pick.
Precisely. And even for topics where the overall variation wasn't quite that extreme, the percentage differences in how much space was allocated could still be really significant. Cognitive development, for example, had a notable range. And classroom measurement and evaluation, get this, the difference in page allocation between the textbook with the least coverage and the one with the most was a staggering 2,800%.
2,800%. Wow. Okay. That really highlights how different instructors, even using seemingly similar core materials, might end up emphasizing quite different aspects of educational psychology.
Absolutely. But the review also points to a clear trend in these modern textbooks, an increasing effort to connect the theoretical concepts to practical classroom applications. To answer that "so what" question for aspiring teachers?
Yes, it mentions a variety of features designed specifically to show the practical value.
Right. Things like specific sections offering concrete suggestions for teaching, classroom scenarios or vignettes to illustrate abstract ideas, concise boxed guidelines for applying principles in real-world situations, and even problem-solving tasks to get the reader actively thinking about how to use the material.
So it seems like textbook authors are really consciously trying to bridge that gap between the theory we learn about and the actual practicalities you face when you have your own classroom.
Yeah, definitely seems that way. Which leads us nicely to the perspectives of the people actually using these textbooks, the instructors themselves. The review details a survey of 20 educational psychology instructors. What were their thoughts on the coverage in these books?
Right, what did they say?
Well, the survey revealed that most instructors generally do cover the majority of the topics found in the textbooks. In fact, for 22 of the 26 identified topics, more than half of the instructors reported spending either an average or above average amount of class time on them. So there seems to be a general alignment between what the textbooks offer and what's being taught.
Okay, so they're mostly covering what's in the book. But there were a couple of surprises, right?
Yeah.
Areas that weren't getting as much attention as you might expect.
Yes, exactly. Half of the instructors reported not covering language development at all, which seems kind of important for teachers.
Yeah, half. Wow.
and 30% said they didn't address cultural or socioeconomic differences in their courses. Now, the review does acknowledge a really important point here. These topics might very well be covered in other courses within the broader teacher education program, like a multicultural education course or something.
Right. That's a crucial caveat. Teacher training isn't just one course.
Exactly. So their absence in the EdPsych course doesn't necessarily mean future teachers aren't being exposed to them at all.
That's fair. But what about what the instructors themselves felt was truly important? Did their priorities line up with what they actually spent time on?
That's where we see some interesting nuances. The instructors overwhelmingly agreed on the importance of exposing students to a wide array of topics within educational psychology. They rated areas like student motivation, the fundamental processes of learning, cognitive and social emotional development, understanding the role and value of EdPsych itself, how to assess learning in the classroom, the impact of emotions and social interactions on learning, and cultural and socioeconomic differences as highly important.
How highly?
Well, between 60% and 95% of instructors gave those topics top priority.
Okay, those all sound incredibly relevant for anyone preparing to guide young learners. So did the actual time they spent in class align with these priorities?
Not perfectly, no. The review highlights a bit of a mismatch. Only motivation, how we process information, learning through rewards and consequences, operant conditioning, and cognitive development actually received above average coverage from more than half of the instructors.
Huh. So even though they said things like cultural differences or social emotional development were highly important, they didn't necessarily spend above average time on them.
Exactly. So while there's a consensus on the value of broad exposure and high priority for certain areas, the instructional time doesn't always perfectly mirror those stated priorities.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good picture now of what educational psychology is, how it's presented in textbooks, and what the instructors themselves value and teach. But the central question, the one that probably brought many of you to this deep dive, remains: does learning about all these theories and principles actually make a difference? Does it help students become better teachers in the real world?
Right. And this is where the review builds a really interesting case for the value of educational psychology. The first key point it makes is that teaching is just inherently complex. It's Psych's research demonstrating that teaching demands a high level of general knowledge and specific professional preparation, including the ability to think logically and scientifically.
Complex how?
Well, in fact, teaching ranks in the top quarter of all occupations when it comes to complexity. This suggests that teachers really need a strong foundation of knowledge, including psychological principles, to effectively navigate the, multifaceted challenges of the classroom. It's not simple stuff.
That absolutely resonates. Teaching isn't just knowing your subject right. It's about understanding the incredibly diverse ways different minds learn. And the review's second point builds right on that, highlighting a body of research that offers concrete, evidence-based ideas for improving how we teach.
Exactly. The review references the work of several prominent researchers who have consistently identified instructional practices supported by evidence. Things like using peer tutoring to help students learn from each other, providing positive reinforcement and specific corrective feedback, not just saying good job, but explaining why, clearly communicating what you expect from students, asking questions that push them beyond just recall, encouraging higher level thinking, giving students cues about what's coming up in a lesson, explicitly teaching self-monitoring and independent learning skills, understanding the common misconceptions students might bring to a topic, finding new ways to organize information or frame problems, emphasizing the teacher's role and responsibility in student outcomes, and utilizing cooperative learning groups effectively. All of these practices are grounded in research from educational psychology.
Yeah, these are all strategies that, when you think about really effective teaching you've seen or experienced, they seem pretty fundamental, don't they?
They really do. And the third part of the argument looks directly at how prepared new teachers actually feel when they first enter the profession.
The surveys of beginners, what did they find?
Yes, the review summarizes findings from several surveys. And while the specific areas of strength and weakness reported vary a bit across different studies, some consistent themes definitely emerge. New teachers often feel relatively well prepared in areas like understanding adolescent development and knowing how to assess student learning.
Okay, that's good.
But They frequently express feeling less prepared in crucial areas such as managing the classroom effectively, motivating students, especially those who seem disengaged, and addressing the diverse needs of individual learners. That includes students from different cultural backgrounds and those with exceptional learning needs.
Yeah, those are often cited as the real on-the-ground challenges that trip up new educators. Classroom management, motivation, differentiation. It's interesting that even though these topics are generally covered in educational psychology courses, the feeling of preparedness doesn't always match the perceived importance.
It is interesting. However, the review also points out a finding that a significant majority, like 80% of teachers, actually felt adequately prepared in the skills that are typically addressed in educational psychology coursework.
Oh, okay, so maybe it's not as dire as it sometimes sounds?
Well, it's complex, and other research indicated positive perceptions of preparedness in areas like understanding student differences and diagnosing learning needs. Furthermore, another study found that beginning teachers were indeed using various instructional techniques they learned in college, behavioral, humanistic, constructivist, cooperative learning strategies. They were using the toolkit.
So it's not a complete disconnect then. It seems like teachers are drawing on some of the principles they encountered in their education, even if they still feel shaky in some areas.
Right. And what about the direct link between taking education coursework, including educational psychology, and actual teacher effectiveness in the classroom? Is there evidence for that?
Yeah. Does
Yeah.
doing well in the course translate?
Ferguson and Womack's research provides a really compelling insight here. They found that a teacher's grades in education courses, including educational psychology, were actually a better predictor of their later effectiveness in the classroom than their knowledge of the subject matter they were teaching.
Wow, really? Better than subject knowledge.
That's what they found. They even quantified it, suggesting that a notable portion, about 16.5% of the difference in teacher effectiveness, could be attributed to the quality of their education coursework.
That's a pretty powerful statement about the value of understanding the science of learning and teaching, not just the content.
Absolutely. And the review further illustrates this with some really interesting case study examples.
Oh yeah, tell me about those.
Well, there's the story of a mathematics teacher who initially really struggled, had an out-of-control classroom apparently. But then, after learning and consciously applying principles of reinforcement, clear presentations, effective questioning techniques, even Bloom's taxonomy, they found success.
So a direct application of EdPsych principles turned things around.
It seems so in that case. Similarly, Grossman's analysis comparing English teachers who had gone through a formal teacher education program with those who hadn't really highlights the impact of having a theoretical framework for instruction. The untrained teachers were described as kind of naive and disorganized in their approach and often struggled to figure out why their students weren't learning.
Whereas the trained ones?
The ones with training demonstrated a greater ability to use strategies like instructional scaffolding, drawing on the work of Vygotsky and Brunner. They had a conceptual toolkit to draw from.
Those real-world examples definitely help to solidify the connection between the theory and the practice. So, okay, let's loop back to the initial question we posed. Why might some students perceive educational psychology as, well, irrelevant to their future careers? How does the review address that potential disconnect, given all this evidence?
Right. The review revisits those four possible reasons we considered earlier. First, the idea that key topics are being completely omitted. That seems unlikely, given the broad coverage we see in both textbooks and course outlines.
Okay, so it's probably not that stuff is missing entirely.
Probably not. Second, insufficient depth. While there might be some concern about the depth of coverage for certain topics, as we saw with that huge variation in page counts, but the review suggests the bigger issue might be the sheer number of topics covered, potentially leading to a sense of superficial understanding rather than deep learning on any one thing.
Like spreading yourself too thin.
Kind of, yeah. Third, the notion that current textbooks lack a focus on practical application. That also seems largely contradicted by the increasing emphasis on classroom strategies, suggestions for teaching, vignettes, and all those features we discussed.
Right, the books seem to be trying harder on that front.
They do. So it really seems to boil down to that last point, the sheer breadth of the field being presented, perhaps all at once.
Okay, explain that a bit more.
Well, while the intention behind covering so many topics is good to provide a comprehensive overview, it might inadvertently lead to information overload. Students might just struggle to deeply understand and effectively internalize, let alone apply, so many different concepts crammed into one course. The review suggests that this uncertain grasp of the material could be a significant factor in why some students feel disconnected from its relevance.
And those case studies sort of hinted at that too, didn't they? That teachers tend to recall and use a smaller set of core principles.
Exactly. It suggested that teachers often rely on a relatively focused set of principles from their educational psychology training, the ones they really grasped and found useful.
Okay, so if this breadth is a potential hurdle, what kind of solutions does the review propose for making educational psychology more relevant and impactful for future teachers? How do we fix it?
The review offers a few potential pathways forward. One option is straightforward. Simply reduce the number of topics covered in introductory courses. Allow for a more in-depth exploration of core principles and their application.
Cut some stuff out to go deeper on the rest.
Basically. But this approach has its downsides, right? You risk omitting potentially valuable ideas, and it's a real challenge to decide which topics are less essential. Who gets to choose?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's a tricky balancing act between breadth and depth. What else?
Another, perhaps almost ideal solution suggested is to expand the introductory sequence into 2 semesters.
A year-long course instead of one term.
Right. This would provide the necessary time for both a broad overview of the field and a more thorough examination of key concepts, along with plenty of opportunity to explore practical applications. But, as the review acknowledges, implementing such a change might face significant logistical and administrative hurdles within existing teacher education programs. Adding required courses is never easy.
Yeah, finding room in the curriculum, staffing, that can definitely be a big lift. So what's the most feasible solution the review ultimately lands on?
The most practical suggestion seems to be this. Keep the current 1-semester broad overview course, the survey course, but then offer an elective 1-semester course that focuses on a more select group of topics.
An optional follow-up.
Exactly. This follow-up course would delve into those chosen topics in greater depth and really emphasize the practical applications of the concepts learned in the first course. This model allows all students to get that foundational understanding, but those with specific interests or those who really see the direct relevance to their intended teaching context can choose to explore those areas more deeply.
That sounds like a really thoughtful and balanced approach, actually. A good compromise. It gives everyone the basics, but offers a path for deeper engagement for those who want or need it.
Yeah, it seems like a pragmatic way forward.
Okay, so to sort of bring our deep dive to a close here, what are the key takeaways for you, our listener, from this whole exploration of educational psychology?
Well, I think the main points to remember are that, first, educational psychology is this vast and constantly evolving field really dedicated to understanding and improving teaching and learning. Second, it's typically presented to aspiring teachers through a really wide array of topics, though there's a clear and positive trend towards incorporating more practical classroom applications in the materials.
Right.
Third, while some students might question its immediate relevance, and that feeling is real research, strongly suggests that educational psychology coursework does contribute to better teacher preparedness and effectiveness down the line.
Okay, so it does matter.
It seems to. But finally, the very breadth of the field might be a double-edged sword. Covering so much ground might actually hinder the deep understanding and confident application of key principles that teachers really need.
And that leaves us with a final thought, something for you to consider. Given this inherent tension, this pull between wanting to provide a comprehensive overview of educational psychology and the need for future teachers to truly understand and apply a core set of principles, what specific areas do you believe are absolutely essential for new teachers to grasp deeply? What's non-negotiable? And maybe what innovative ways might teacher education programs adopt to facilitate that deeper understanding and really bridge the gap between theory and the messy, wonderful reality of the classroom?
Yeah, it's a complex question, isn't it?
It really is, and one that's definitely worth pondering as you continue on your own learning journey, whether you're a teacher, a student, or just someone interested in how we learn. Thanks for diving deep with us today.